Peter Thiel boasts in the book that, people who started PayPal with him, most had built a bomb in high school. That's the kind of personality, a bit weird, a bit contrarian, a bit wacky, that Peter looks for. He is the most self-consciously contrarian of all these investors, I would say. I mean, everybody in venture capital is trying to be a bit contrarian, because unless you do something unexpected, it's not going to break out and create a new product. But Peter Thiel really takes it to kind of extreme degree. And he wrote in that book, 0 to 1, about the power law. And I was so struck by that idea that I used it as the title for my book. The idea being that when a venture capitalist makes 10 bets, 7 or 8 might go to zero, you get nothing back at all, which would be a complete disaster for a normal investor. But it's okay in venture capital because the last couple will return more than 10 times the capital invested. And it's that power law distribution of returns, not like a bell curve where most bets are kind of near the average bet. You've got a bunch of zeros and then you've got these complete grand slams. When you think about, my job here is to get the grand slams. The losses sort of don't matter, they're not going to make a difference. But what matters is not to miss the potential companies that could be the grand slam. And that really forces you to kind of get out of your comfort zone, be contrarian, reach for that uncomfortable but possibly breakout kind of idea.
And joining us now on Open Book, Sebastian Mallaby, a brilliant author. And Sebastian, I got to tell you, I've read several of your books and your bylines. Your most recent book, The Power Law, Venture Capital and the Making of the New Future, out this past year. Another fascinating book by you. Congratulations. What attracted you? I know you did a big book on the hedge fund space about 10 years ago, which was a great book. I want to talk to you a little bit about that as well. But what attracted you to writing about venture capital at this moment?
The first thing is simply, how do you even do venture capital, right? I mean, most kinds of investment, there are quantitative metrics. When you make an investment, you do a price earnings ratio, what have you. When you have two-legged mammals who walk into your office with a dream, there are no earnings, there is no price ratio, right? So that's the first kind of intellectual mystery. And then the second thing is kind of, what does it mean for the world, right? Why is it that Silicon Valley dominated innovation for so long? Was it because of the venture capital that was there? Or did the venture guys just show up and exploit it? And why did China take off? So I grapple with some of those kind of core questions about where innovation comes from.
I guess the thing that struck me is this is for a professional investor, a traditional investor. People buy stocks and bonds, they ride the market up and down, but venture capital is more like hit or miss. Is that fair to say? I mean, I got the feeling while I was reading your book is that, a lot of the times people are shooting in the dark. Kleiner Perkins on Amazon, the guys that put the first money into Facebook. Tell me about the personalities of the people that make investments like this.
Well, when I was writing about hedge funds, I had a lot of meetings with people who kind of looked at their own shoes and didn't look you in the eye, and they were very analytical, very smart, quite good at explaining their thought process, but not natural schmoozers. And in venture capital, it's the opposite. You've got to be out there meeting entrepreneurs or you'll never make an investment. You've got to be out there meeting engineers that the guy you backed last month needs to hire 5 engineers. You've got to go help to find those engineers. So you've got to be a natural networker in venture capital. And it's a very story-driven world where the analysis and the stories can be a bit obscure sometimes. So, one is kind of crunchy analytical, that's hedge funds, and one is more schmoozy and kind of networky, and that's venture capital.
I guess the some of the biggest success stories over the last 25 years have come out of the venture space. But yet these guys, they go after people. It's another thing I learned from you. They go after people that don't win. They have a tremendous amount of control over a founder's company. Why do you think founders are so willing to do that with venture capitalists?
Well, I mean, the original point is that you can't sell a venture capital investment, right? It's not a liquid investment. It's an illiquid bet on a startup, and there's no way out. So you can't control your downside as the investor by selling it. You've got to control the downside by going on the board of the startup and telling the founder if he or she is driving the car off the road. And so that's going back, the investors kind of insisted on that. And the venture, the receivers of the venture capital, the startup founders, had to put up with that. And then over time, as venture capital became more plentiful, there was more and more deference to the founders. More capital being provided meant that the providers had less leverage. And so bit by bit, there was this founder deference, and founders became more imperious and less beholden to the financiers.
You also talk about. I mean, there was a phrase in the book that we highlighted. It's a machine for manufacturing courage. Sebastian, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean it partly in a sort of specific sense. If you think about, one engineer who's halfway up a large tech company and has an idea for a new product, and that engineer has a boss who says, we're not doing it. And it might be that, the boss is scared of it because if that new idea were to work, it would cannibalize the existing product line for the company. So you think about Xerox. Xerox was a photocopying company, right? And when Xerox PARC engineers invented the personal computer, invented the graphical user interface, invented the mouse, they were scared that a computerized office meant a paperless office, and a paperless office meant no more photocopying. So they never sold and commercialized that invention, even though they got there first, and they allowed Steve Jobs to steal all the ideas and make a lot of money from it with Apple. So you get this engineer. We imagine this engineer halfway up the company. He's got a good idea, but he can't commercialize it. And in a world without venture capital, that's the end of it. In a world with venture capital, this engineer runs into a venture capitalist at a sports event or a party or whatever it is a couple of weeks later and says, well, I had this idea. It was a good idea, but I couldn't do anything with it. And the VC says, of course you can. Set up a company. And the engineer says, yeah, but I don't have any money. And the VC says, well, I'll raise it for you. And the engineer says, yeah, but I don't know even how do you do a company? How do you incorporate it? And the VC says, oh, don't worry, I got lawyers. They'll do that for you. And then the engineer says, yeah, but I need to hire 5 guys to come and help me build the prototype of this new product I have in mind. They've got to be really good engineers. And the venture capitalist says, sure, I got a whole Rolodex. I'll introduce you to 15 engineers and you can pick the 5 that you like. And then the engineer says, yeah, but why would these 5 great engineers leave safe jobs at Google and Microsoft and come work with me? Because startups might fail. And the venture capitalist finally says, you know what, that's true. They might fail, but I'm going to tell these engineers that if they come work with you and they do a good job and your startup fails, I'm going to get them a new job in a different startup, right? So it turns it's a one-off game, which is risky, into a repeat game, which is much less risky. And when I spoke with Eric Schmidt, the former chief executive of Google at the beginning of Google, he said to me he would never have done that job and taken the risk of going to work with the founders, who were these young punks who thought that anybody aged over 30 was dumb. He wouldn't have done that risk if the venture capitalist John Doerr hadn't said to him, look, Eric, if the young punks bounce you out of Google, don't worry, I'll make you chief executive of a different startup. So look, entrepreneurship is always risky and tough, but it is a lot less risky and a lot less tough if you've got venture capitalists turning that one-off game into a repeat game.
Listen, I think it's amazing to me, because I had met Eric. I think he was at Nortel, coming out of Nortel, and he was in, the middle, latish part of his career. And he was supposed to be the adult in the room at Google. Now, he obviously did a brilliant job and made billions of dollars as a result of it. And it was a synthesis that John Doerr created. He also did the same thing, John Doerr, for Amazon. One of my classmates from Harvard Law School went to work for him and became his CFO. She was at Kleiner Perkins and moved to Seattle to prepare Jeff Bezos's firm for a public offering. So So the point is that the VCs can install executive skills, they can provide backup, they can provide comfort to other senior leadership. All this stuff well documented in your book. We have cynics out there that would say investors just leech on entrepreneurs. Talk us through what you learned in the book about this, the network effect VCs have, and then get into some of the stories like the late Don Valentine, and then, of course, the very famous 𝗕𝗺𝗀𝗀𝗃, who attended our SALT conference last September, who I found to be brilliant. But do they leech off the entrepreneurs, or are they aiding and abetting the entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so I mean, another way of putting that question is to say, do the VCs create innovation or do they just show up for it, right? And Josh Lerner of Harvard Business School uses that terminology. I very much take the view that they help to create the innovation. Of course, the entrepreneurs are very important, but unless you connect entrepreneurs to capital, to the first employees that they hire, unless you help to introduce them to their customers, unless you basically kind of guide them through the ups and downs, it's going to be much tougher for entrepreneurs to turn their ideas into real companies. And so I think venture capitalists are basically experts in building startups, and that is a big value add. And as you said, quite rightly, the network is a big part of this. You've got to connect up people. And there's a big difference and an interesting kind of case study. If you compare what happened in Boston in the 1980s, right, which was a tech system in and of itself, it had traditionally been the heart of the military industrial complex. It had computer companies like Wang and DEC and so forth. And it fell behind Silicon Valley. Why? Because in Boston, there were fewer VCs, there were vertically integrated and secretive companies where people didn't kind of get out of that company and talk to other people. Whereas in the West Coast, there were these small startups with lots of VCs, and they were all going to the same bars, going to the same sporting events, exchanging ideas. The job of a venture capitalist, in a way, is to get up and have breakfast with one person and then have 14 cups of coffee. And we hope that they are decaffeinated with different people before they go to bed. It's about linking people up so that ideas and money and talent circulate through the Silicon Valley ecosystem, and multiple different attempts at creating these combinations between the ideas and the talent and the money. That's what creates innovation.
I think it's fascinating. I learned a tremendous amount from your book. Let's talk about Peter Thiel for a moment with his Founders Fund. Give me your thoughts on Peter Thiel. I've read his book, 0 to 1. I find him to be incredibly fascinating. I'm not going to talk about his politics because, frankly, he's got some weird stuff going on in his politics, Sebastian. But let's just talk about him as a founder, the mentality of his VC investing, and his personal philosophies on investing.
He is the most sort of self-consciously contrarian of all these investors, I would say. Everybody in venture capital is trying to be a bit contrarian, because unless you do something unexpected, it's not going to break out and create a new product. So you have to be contrarian. But Peter Thiel really takes it to a kind of extreme degree. And he wrote in that book, 0 to 1, about the power law. And I was so struck by that idea that I used it as the title for my book. The idea being that when a venture capitalist makes 10 bets, 7 or 8 might go to zero. You get nothing back at all, which would be a complete disaster for a normal investor. But it's okay in venture capital because the last couple will return more than 10 times the capital invested. And it's that power law distribution of returns, not like a bell curve where most bets are kind of near the average bet. It's like, you've got a bunch of zeros and then you've got these complete grand slams. And that, when you think about, okay, my job here is to get the grand slams, the losses sort of don't matter. They're not going to make a difference. But what matters is not to miss the potential companies that could be the grand slam. And that really forces you to kind of get out of your comfort zone, be contrarian, reach for that uncomfortable but possibly breakout kind of idea. Peter Thiel boasts in the book that, people who started PayPal with him I don't know, there were 4 or 5 of them, and most had built a bomb in high school. And that's the kind of personality, a bit weird, a bit contrarian, a bit wacky, that Peter looks for.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting guy. Contrast him to the more famous cohort from PayPal, his co-founder of PayPal, Elon Musk.
Well, I mean, Elon definitely massively risk-friendly as well. There's, the recent episode with, blowing all that money on Twitter and potentially incinerating it. We'll see what happens with that. But I mean, that's certainly an amazing risk appetite. The guy already had a few other companies to run when he did that. He didn't need this, and yet he was clearly sort of restless and wanted to take that on. But going right back to when he was working with Peter Thiel on these sort of breakthrough online payment systems, Elon Musk had one called 𝗕xe.com. Peter Thiel did PayPal. They merged them together with the name PayPal. And so they worked together for a bit, although often they were fighting each other. But there was one moment when they were off to try and raise some more money on Sand Hill Road from the venture capitalists. And they got into a supercar, that McLaren, that Elon had bought with the proceeds from his first company that he'd started. And Peter's like, okay, so how fast does this thing go? And Elon says, I'll show you. Hits the accelerator, crashes into the median strip of the street. Car flips up in the air, does a 360, lands. They get out, just before it starts to sort of smolder with smoke. And Elon is just laughing his head off. And Peter's like, what, dude, we nearly died. What's up with you? Why are you laughing? And Elon says, because we didn't have insurance. And he thought that was funny. So, I mean, there is something pathologically risk-friendly, which is just not like a normal person.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, and we don't know the people who have that pathology that have crashed and burned in the car or have blown up. And so what typically happens is we make famous and we lionize the people who take on all of this risk. And, they're good execution, geniuses, et cetera. But we both know the vagaries of life, and a lot of things do go wrong. And there's a lot of risk takers that, frankly, the reason why it's risk is that there's a potentiality of failure. Let's unpack some of the big names and the main things you learned about each of them after writing the book. And so let's start with Facebook.
Mm-hmm. So Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, arriving in pajamas, right, to a meeting with Sequoia, the top venture capital partnership in Silicon Valley. That was an extraordinary moment. He basically marked the shift that I was talking about earlier from the venture capitalist being in control and telling the entrepreneur what to do, to the entrepreneur, even at the age of 19 or 20 or whatever he was that day, showing up, deliberately late in his pajamas, presenting then a slide deck, which says, 10 reasons why you shouldn't invest in my company. And he was just kind of mocking Sequoia. And then he walked out of that meeting, of course, didn't want to take any capital from Sequoia. He'd made that very clear. And eventually there's this dance that goes on between Accel Capital, another venture partnership, and Zuckerberg and his colleagues. And it's, they managed, Accel manages to persuade him to take some capital. And then not long after that, Sean Parker, the president of Facebook, gets busted on a beach house somewhere in the Carolinas with, various illegal substances, underage women and so forth. And, I don't think that went to trial, so who knows if it was guilt or not. But the point is, there was a massive reputational hit to Facebook. And it was the venture capitalist who forced Mark Zuckerberg to boot Sean Parker out of the company. And so that was the reassertion of venture capital influence over Mark Zuckerberg. And my own personal view is that, everybody, even if they are as smart as Mark, do better when they have oversight. And it was the right thing to get rid of Sean Parker at that time, because he would have just created a toxic culture within Facebook, which would have been even worse than what people think they perceive without Sean Parker having been there. And in general, brilliant company founders may be brilliant, but they do need venture capitalists on their board to tell them where the limits are to their behavior.
Let's go to WeWork. I love these ones, Sebastian, that end up as Apple Plus miniseries. Of course, I'm sure FTX is going to end up as one of those. But let's go to WeWork.
Right. So with WeWork, what people forget is that right at the beginning, when Adam Neumann, the Tarzan lookalike, started this, short-term office rental business, it actually was doing well and making money. Believe it or not, it made money. And so when Benchmark, one of the storied venture capital partnerships on Sand Hill Road, when they made the investment in WeWork, it was a perfectly sensible thing to do. And in fact, they made a ton of money at the beginning. But then what happened, and this is sort of emblematic of the period around 2016, 2017, 2018, when venture capital started to go a bit crazy, is that you had these later stage investors who weren't doing the really startup stuff, but they were coming in when the company was already a unicorn, it was already worth more than $1 billion. And they essentially were throwing cash at the successful founders like Adam Neumann. And at that point, all the oversight and checks and balances from the investors go out the window, because you get these new investors in who say, Mr. Founder, in this case, Adam Neumann, you are a genius. Please allow us to invest. It would be such a privilege. We'll throw money at you, and we won't really do anything to restrain your ambition and your craziness. And that's when WeWork went off the rails, and they had this plan for an IPO. It had to be pulled because it was a joke. The financials were all screwed up by then. And Adam Neumann, had to be kicked out of the company at huge expense. And the IPO was pulled.
This is sort of a weird question, but I've been dying to ask you this. So Adam Neumann is coming in there with the long hair. He's a little bit of a cult-like figure. You have Mark Zuckerberg. When he came on the scene 18 to 20 years ago, he was wearing a hood. Let's call it a hoodie. He went to the IPO, rang the bell at the exchange in a hoodie. You've got Sam Bankman-Fried. He's in his T-shirt and his white socks and his gym shorts. Do we make a mistake? Is there tells in the way these people look or dress, or did the success of Mark Zuckerberg make us say, hey, there's no problem with the way people look and or dress? What are the signals to venture capitalists, if any, about a founder?
Well, I'm talking to a man right now with a hip black T-shirt, and so I'm not going to pass judgment on people with T-shirts. No, look, I think, there are tons of founders who dressed in hoodies and were very serious and did great work. I don't think it's about the clothing. I think that's just a reflection of what happened around the period when Mark Zuckerberg came to the fore is that the world moved from hardware projects definitively to software projects. And software by its nature can be done by somebody very young who's just learned some coding, has a product idea, like, okay, we'll do social media, and they can code it up. And you don't need to be a credentialed engineer who knows how to do sort of the management of big budgets in a manufacturing kind of thing. So if you go back to the days when people were doing, routers and disk drives and personal computers and semiconductors, there you needed grown-ups, right? Because there was a lot of capital being invested in big production facilities and you couldn't mess around. But with software, cheaply and quickly, you could code it up, release it. If it didn't work, you tweaked it, you do alpha beta testing. You could move fast and break things because fixing the things that you broke was pretty easy when it was just software, right? So I think that's why you had the shift to youth. And with the shift to youth, you got the shift to hoodies. And I think it's not much more to it than that.
Yeah, no. I accepted an investment from Sam. Sam turned out to be a fraud. I had him as the Mark Zuckerberg of crypto. I didn't see him as the Bernie Madoff of crypto. And I'm just wondering out loud about, how we catch and how we miss things. When you interview these venture capitalists, they obviously learn more from their failures than they do from their successes. So what are some of the tips that you picked up from them about their failures and what they've learned from them?
I think the really thoughtful ones try to bring decision science, behavioral science into their process. And one example would be, it's often the mistake is to miss a great investment. If you invest in something and it blows up, you lose 1 times your capital. If you miss a great investment, you miss the opportunity to make 10 times or 50 times your capital. So it's the misses that are really painful. It's the shadow portfolio that you didn't invest in. And there, there's various kinds of behavioral sort of distortion in how we think as human beings, which you can try to address. So one example would be people anchor on stuff they've said before. If they've been out publicly to their colleagues saying, XYZ company and founder just not very good, they're going to be reluctant to change their mind. So what happens sometimes is company comes along at the beginning, it's raising Series A money, the first round, and you choose to pass. And then it does well, and it comes back and says, okay, now it's Series B. I'm looking for the next tranche of capital to build to the next stage. Will you invest? And there's a sort of kind of knee-jerk thing that you just kind of say, you find reasons to say no, because you don't want to admit that you were wrong the first time. But you should try to clear that out of your thinking, right? And in the same way, another behavioral bias is that people normally have loss aversion, like they find it very painful to lose money, more so than they are willing to take risks to gain money. And of course, in a power law distribution where it is all about trying to get more than 10x on your upside, and you shouldn't care about the downside so much, you've got to think your way out of that loss aversion that human beings typically have.
It's very well said. I think it's brilliant. Investors in the 60s and 70s, they tended to be generalists. And then you discussed the launch of Axel Capital. I know a lot of the partners there in 1983, and they were the first to say that their fund was going to be specializing in a small number of areas. What has happened to the generalists? Is the days of generalist VC investing over? Are we just in too complex of a world?
Yeah, I think it also goes back to, the discussion we had earlier about how venture capitalists are in fact adding value. They make an investment, they go on the board, they help to hire people. And it's just easier to add value if you are specialized in the technology that you're investing in. And if you do everything from, biotech to software, it's going to be tough to know what you're talking about. And so as the space has become more sophisticated and there have been more competitors crowding in, the way you get a competitive edge over other investors is that you know a heck of a lot about the technologies that you invest in.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and I find that the even in it's everything, medicine, the world of investing, everything's going way more into specialization. Switching to the chapter on China. Where we're obviously there's an East-West struggle going on in China. You reference in the book that China's technology boom was forged to a remarkable extent by American investors. Obviously, Alibaba is a good example of that. What do you think is going to happen now that we have this sort of Cold War going on, tension? What do you think happens to the Chinese technology boom or their economy, et cetera, as a result of the political situation?
I think the political clampdown on startups, which began, I think, in late 2019 when Jack Ma of Alibaba sort of disappeared for a while, and then followed with, blocking various IPOs in the US that Chinese startups wanted to do. That has been pretty bad for the tech ecosystem in China. It's just, the incentive to go out and build a company, if you know that when the company succeeds, the government's going to come down on you and say you can't do your IPO and whatever. Obviously the incentives go down. And I think you don't see that effect immediately because the folks who are leading Chinese tech are embedded in that. They can't leave. They can't just walk away. They've got companies or they've got investments if they're venture capitalists, and these are illiquid, and they can't just walk out of the country because they would leave all their wealth behind them. So you don't see immediate effects, but I think over time, what you're going to see behind the scenes is that these people who are locked in there are quietly telling their children, hey, why don't you go make your career in Canada or Singapore or whatever it is. Real estate prices in Singapore right now are shooting up. Why is that? It's because talent is leaking from China into Singapore. So I think it's going to be a problem. It remains to be seen if the government does a U-turn, right, on its attitude towards tech, just like it's done a U-turn just recently on the COVID clampdown, the zero tolerance for COVID. That surprised a lot of people, and maybe they'll do a similar U-turn in terms of their attitude to entrepreneurship. But I think, absent that, it's a negative for the Chinese outlook.
I just got back from Singapore. They are obviously directly benefiting from the tension that's going on, the East-West tension. What's your opinion of the South Korean venture capital market?
I don't know quite as much about that, and I think that's probably because, tech in South Korea is traditionally dominated by the big guys. You have this tradition of the chaebol, these huge companies like Samsung and so on, Hyundai and so forth. And they have dominated both the economy writ large and also especially the tech economy. And so South Korea has a very strong position in memory chips. That is typically something done by big companies, not by startups. You don't see so many stories coming out of South Korea about small startups innovating.
To me, and again, I'm not a venture capitalist, although I have invested in many of these funds. I'm always blown away by what you were describing. The 10 or 12 go to 0, the 1 goes up 15 to 1. Do you think these guys ever know which ones? Or do you think they ever have any idea, or you think this is just sort of a shotgun approach?
Yeah, if you could phrase this question by saying, is it just purely luck, right? You could say, they don't know, and they're just lucky. And then a more sophisticated variation on that argument is, somebody gets lucky at the beginning. They start a fund, they just get lucky with an investment that does 15x, 20x, and then they get a reputation for having the Midas touch. And then great deal flow comes to them. Other entrepreneurs who are good would like to be funded by them because they're perceived to have the magic touch. And then because they've got good deal flow, guess what? They do well. So there's that would be initial luck plus path dependency. But as I looked at the sector, there are two reasons why I rejected that hypothesis. I almost didn't write this book because I thought it might just be luck. And what persuaded me that it was actually skillful and therefore interesting to write about was, first of all, that when you go see the smartest people, they really do have a story about how they do it. And the story makes sense. And it's stuff like what I shared with you about behavioral science. You integrate that into your decision-making process, you make better decisions. Or you decide to specialize and really know a lot about the sector you're investing in so you can add value to the company. Guess what? That's important, and that makes you better, and you do better. So that's the first thing. There was a plausible story about the skill. And the second thing is, when you look over history in venture capital, you don't see path dependency necessarily winning. So Kleiner Perkins was the top venture capital partnership in 2001. By 2021, it was not even in the top 10. So if it was just path dependency and it was automatic success, that wouldn't have happened. But actually, there is churn, which suggests to me that it is skill.
Yeah, I have to ask you this question. I know we're coming up against the time clock, but and I'm a little biased here. You've written books on venture capital, Sebastian, and hedge funds. Which one was more fun to write about?
I enjoyed, so you're asking me kind of which is my favorite child. I enjoyed them both. I guess.
Oh, I can tell you my favorite child. My daughter is my favorite child. I have 4 sons, and they all know that she's my favorite, including her. But go ahead. I'm sorry. Which one do you like better?
You have what's different about you. You have the guts to go out and say that out loud. Others are less. Others are less brave.
I like sticking it to my son, Sebastian. That's why I say that all the time to them. But and they take it well. I might add, they take it well. Which one did you like better, if you're willing to say?
I enjoyed the venture capital one enormously, because there's something crazy exciting about building the future and believing in tech. And you know what? The other thing is, I think we're in a world where people are so pessimistic. They're pessimistic because we've got climate change. They're pessimistic because we've got screwed up politics. We've got inequality. We've got negative demography. We've got all these problems. And my goodness, it's refreshing to focus on the tech, which doesn't always have the solution, but at least has the hope of maybe making things better.
Very, very well said. Well, I greatly appreciate you joining us on Open Book. I find your writing to be super fascinating. The one thing I would say to my viewers and listeners that listen to an Open Book, to find your byline wherever it is. You've got this sensational writing style, and even though it's my industry, the hedge fund industry, I learned so much from you in that first book. I couldn't wait to get a copy of the new book. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy a few months ago. The book is fabulous. It's called The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby. Thank you so much for joining us on Open Book.
It was really fun. Thank you so much for having me.
In the closing thoughts section of today on Open Book, I just want to point out that every time I interview an author like this, I learn something. And I want to express to people how hard it is to actually write a book. Sebastian did an amazing amount of research in this industry. He interviewed people from all walks of life, and he interviewed some very difficult people, frankly, that never take interviews and never like to be interviewed. And so one of the reasons why we started Open Book is to give you a portal into all of that. If I'm bringing on an author like Sebastian Mallaby, he's worth listening to for many reasons, but here are several. His books are well-researched. His books are objective and factual, and his books are providing a window in a condensed amount of information to somebody that you could not get on your own. This is somebody that went out and did 6 months worth of research for you, did all of these different interviews, and then he had to edit and condense it into a small treatise. And I'm just blown away at his ability to make sense of things that are very, very complex. And so for myself, I think of venture capital. It's a hit or miss business. You know, we know that a good venture capitalist can go 1 for 10, even 1 for 15, and just have this incredibly successful career. Imagine the sheer terror of managing a book of business where you know you're only going to get 1 out of every 15 things right. And imagine if you've gone 0 for 14 and you're sitting there with your 15 investments, say, geez, this could be wrong as well. That is the beauty of venture capital, so eloquently described by Sebastian Mallaby. The truth be told, you have to take risk to create economic innovation. You have to take risk to advance the world. And it's a combination of having bold thinking entrepreneurs and bold thinking capital allocators. And I think Sebastian has captured that very, very well in his latest book. Thank you for joining us today on Open Book.